Hello and welcome to Food Systems, a podcast from the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, where we discuss issues that can shape a sustainable food system, from farm to fork, from policy to consumers, and everything in between. I'm your host, Robert de Graaf, and you can find us on Twitter at Forum for Ag. In the aftermath of FFA 2021, these episodes will be available every week on all major podcast platforms. Before we get started, we would like to say a quick thank you to the FFA founding partners, the European Landowners Organization and Syngenta, as well as the FFA strategic partners, Cargill, the Nature Conservancy, Thought for Food, and the World Wildlife Fund. Please enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome back to a new episode of Food Systems. Today we are talking to David Cleary. He is the Director for Agriculture at the Nature Conservancy and has previously worked extensively in the Amazon and Brazil. In the run-up to our FFA regional event in Portugal, we'll be talking about sustainability in international trade today. David, thank you so much for joining Food Systems.
It's a pleasure.
It's been more than 15 years ago since you were involved in shaping a partnership between the Nature Conservancy and the trading company Cargill. If you look back on that period, how have these partnerships for sustainability in global trade evolved? What have you seen and learned?
I think two things. One is they've become more structural and more focused along the entire supply chain. About 15 years ago, it was more focused on local geographies and local problems. The other difference I would say is that we're much more sophisticated these days in working also with the financial sector and looking at the whole question of financial incentives. So we have many more economists and people with the finance sector background working in the NGO world now than we did back then.
Have the results become better over time as well? If you look at what's being done now versus what's being done 10 or 15 years ago?
Well, you'd have to say at one level, and the most important level, no, because the level of tropical deforestation is still, fairly stable at a level higher than we'd like to see it. And the history of the last 10, 15 years is we've seen improvements in some areas that have lasted for a while and then reversions back to this more destructive mean. That's certainly been the case in the Amazon, where there was a strong fall in deforestation about 10 years ago, but it's been going up again 3 or 4 years, for the last 3 or 4 years. Indonesia was much worse than the Amazon for a period, but is now actually better, and there have been recent improvements. So it's been a bit like whack-a-mole. Some places have improved, other places get worse, but it's difficult to say that the deforestation situation has improved over the last 10 or 15 years, unfortunately.
If we look at the history, if you say, if we'd have known what we know now 10 or 15 years ago, this is what we should have done from the jump. Is there anything in particular that we say, that's what we should have gotten right earlier?
We should have paid more attention to financial incentives and the economics of transitioning to zero deforestation production at the farm level. You can only go so far with command and control systems, and you need a combination of both command and control, strong regulation that gives you the sort of floor from which you work, but without making the numbers work for farmers. In the final analysis, success is achieved by farmers changing their behavior, and they change their behavior on the basis of what they think is economically advantageous. And there's limits to what regulators can do around that.
Is that a situation that's improving now? I mean, we've talked on a previous podcast about sort of ESG and sustainable investing. Is this a real drive, do you think, or is this greenwashing?
I think there is a lot of capital out there, far more than used to be, which is prepared to sort of take a longer term sort of impact investing sort of type of perspective, and that's the type of capital you need to get these things off the ground. I think ESG is much more visible these days. I think it's led to some really strong improvements on the human rights levels. You see, for example, the cotton industry has really improved a great deal. So I think it's been very effective in some levels, but again, on the deforestation front, I think it's oversimplifying to say that commitments companies have made are greenwashing. I think that they're genuinely meant and felt. I don't believe there's cynicism at the headquarters levels where these commitments are typically formulated. But I do feel that implementing those commitments comes up against real political difficulties at the business unit level, and there, so far at least in most companies, hasn't been enough political will at the headquarters level to drive through that. And again, I think the question of incentives there is key. If you're just putting this unfunded mandate from headquarters down to the business unit, it's a very difficult conversation.
If we look at particularly the Amazon region and the issue of deforestation, there's a lot of arguments about what drives it and where it goes, but I think we can all agree that one of them is the expansion of, I'm going to use the word industrial agriculture, driven by trade flows. So particularly we're talking about soy, palm oil, some other big export cash crops. Is it right that the EU essentially continues with such exports with some conditions on it rather than improve its own protein production, or simply just telling its citizens, look, we have to eat less meat because the protein we import is harming the Amazon region?
Well, I think it's obviously this is a conversation that goes beyond the Amazon. It covers palm oil coming from Indonesia. It covers cocoa and coffee coming from West Africa. Those are important industries in those tropical countries, and particularly in West Africa and Indonesia, they support a lot of small farmers. So we don't want to choke off EU demand. We want to send a signal that says we want to continue importing these commodities to support your economy, but our demand, to satisfy our demand, you need to meet certain conditions that are sort of consistent with our values and our environmental concerns. And I think you can do that through a number of different ways, and there's been successes on that front. So most European imports of palm oil are now RSPO certified, for example, which is as good as you can get in terms of a certification standard. Your problem is that you've got other commodities, particularly soy and beef, and the embedded sort of deforestation in, for example, poultry, because that's fed on animal feed that is soy is the main ingredient. Certification is just not going to work for those commodities. It's not going to get enough market penetration. I think for an international trade agreement, the most you can do is insist on legality. And verified legality in your commodity imports. And that, I think, is an important theme in current trade discussions between the EU, Mercosur, and other trading blocs. That's important because the monitoring and control and verification systems you need to set up to establish legality can also serve as a very useful platform for more rigorous monitoring and verification systems that meet the zero deforestation demand that the average European consumer has. So it's a big step towards it. And the reality is that any international trade agreement, if your exporting country believes that there's a problem with the conditions that you're imposing and that they're commercially unfair, and it's not really about environment, you're just using the environment as a backdoor way of restricting market access, they can take you to the ITO, the International Trading Organization, and they'll win. So, that's, I think, the critical issue is that the EU needs to focus very strongly on the obligation to establish the legality of commodity exports. And that sends a really strong signal and also gives a platform for more rigorous approaches that the consumer can also want. It just makes life easier for all concerned, especially the companies that are involved in the trade flows.
I want to come back on trade deals in a moment, but I want to pick up something you just said, that in some cases certification is not enough. That if certification won't do it, where do we proceed then? How do we make the system work better?
I think you grow the proportion of deforestation-free commodity in that trade flow. And you put an obligation on the companies at all stages of the supply chain, from the farm gate to the supermarket, to monitor and establish that deforestation-free status. The reality is that most of the trade flows, most of the volume of the commodities are already deforestation-free because they come from landscapes that were consolidated and turned over to industrial agriculture a very long time ago. So we know, for example, that coming out of the Brazilian Cerrado, which is the major soy-producing area in Brazil, most of the larger companies have got probably between 70 and 90% deforestation-free flow already. So it's a question of getting from what is already a really high number to to 97%. You're never going to get to 100%, unfortunately. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. And the way that you can just make that incremental progress is first by sweating the illegally deforested material out of the supply chain. But in places like the Sahara, just focusing on illegal deforestation isn't going to get you anywhere near the sort of higher 90%. So you need to put the obligation on the trading companies that actually there's 6 or 7 of them that control 90% plus of the trade flow. They need to be documenting and demonstrating and verifying and monitoring that their supply is increasingly deforestation free. There's technologies to do that. The costs to do it are not particularly high. It's largely a question of will to actually get it done, and a combination of will and consumer pressure, and getting those financial incentives in place that make it worthwhile for farmers to do it. Because the reality is that the EU is not alone in the global commodity marketplace. China actually dominates more and more of the market. So if the EU just puts the shutters up and says, well, we're just not going to take it, the producer's always going to have the alternative of selling to China. So that's the sort of problem here, is that if the EU is too rigorous and too sort of ideological in its approach, it's not going to solve the problem. It's just going to displace the problem.
Does that just mean that we need to increase some of the prices for the products produced with things like soy or South American beef? Or if we create financial incentives, who's going to cough up the money to make them real? Where does the money come from?
Yeah, it's going to have to come from everyone. And you can't you can't increase the price. Like, commodity trade runs on really, really small margins. What this is basically about is there are trillions of dollars that flow through these supply chains. So what we need to do is shave off a relatively small proportion of that funding, of that flow, and return it to producers. Now, that's going to be a painful process for the companies that are involved in it, because the traders are going to have to accept that they're very small margins. They're still going to have to employ some of that margin to provide incentives to producers, and the supermarkets are going to have to swallow some of that as well. But I think the critical point is that everyone, including critically governments, needs to recognize that doing this and resolving the deforestation question, that will take care of 1/6 of world GHG emissions. So it has to be part of any proper integrated approach to climate change moving forward. So it is a global problem, and it's going to need a collective solution. So I think the private sector players and the companies are going to have to come up with some of the capital necessary, but you can leverage a lot more of the capital necessary from third parties, and particularly from governments, particularly from impact investors and the more enlightened part of the finance sector. So the reality is we're in this situation because capitalism just isn't properly pricing environmental externalities. So there has to be a collective effort to correct that. And it's, I think the companies are quite right when they say that not all the burden should fall on them. It shouldn't. If consumers want this, then they need to pay for it. But the best way for consumers to pay for it is not through higher prices at the supermarket, because that's going to just reduce the market for these commodities. They should pay through a tiny fraction of their taxes, because they are part of societies where the governments collectively recognize that this is actually a climate change issue, and this is a climate change strategy, and it should be part of the broader arsenal of climate change strategies that we're constantly talking about in relation to the energy sector and the transport sector and what have you.
So let's turn now to, I think, what may be, if not the most controversial, but certainly one of the more talked about trade deals in recent memory, is the EU-Mercosur agreement, which has been signed by the European Commission but not ratified by the member states. There was recently a report out from the EU Ombudsman that the updated sustainability impact assessment was not completed before this deal was actually signed. What does that in practice tell us about the priorities of these trade deals? Is the environment still the second banana to the cars and the beef, essentially.
Well, yes. And I think what it tells you most tellingly, I think, is about the culture, the sort of institutional bureaucratic culture within the European sort of trade negotiation department. Um, it, Anybody standing outside, it's blindingly obvious, I think, that the kind of controversies that you've had around the Mercosur agreement were going to erupt, and they were going to focus on the deforestation question and potentially indigenous rights questions as well. Anyone who doesn't spend their entire time worrying about car import quotas and stuff, that's obvious. So I think the main conclusion that we can take here is that the European Commission's trade negotiation structure, it just hasn't mainstreamed sustainability concerns to the extent that they are already in governments and among the voting and consuming populations in the EU, and that's a major problem. So I would expect and hope that over the next year or so, we'll see the Commission learning a little bit from this experience, and perhaps some long overdue changes will be made.
So, if we were to give you sort of a very broad mandate to change or even just reject the agreement as it stands, are there significant changes that could still be made to this agreement that you would say, okay, that makes it more palatable? Or should we just say, no, we're scrapping it and let's try again?
Well, my own personal position as a general principle is that trade deals are good, and particularly trade deals with countries in the global south. I think we should, as countries and as societies, be as open as we possibly can to the goods that tropical countries can supply. There's direct social benefits for them and for us. However, I think we've already talked about the importance of having policies in place that reflect the sort of values of the importing country and that send out the kind of demand signal that can be both socially and economically helpful in the origination countries. We've also talked about how there is a legal framework around international trade deals. You need to send, I think we need to, as we've discussed, we need to focus on legality. I think it's critical for all commodities, really, but especially environmentally sensitive and forest risk commodities, that you can't do anything, you can't import anything into the EU unless you've got a convincing, robust verification system so that we know that what's coming in has been produced legally. And that's not just in relation to deforestation and environmental concerns, but also in relation to indigenous rights, to labor rights. This is a really important way of influencing our sort of consumer, sending the right kind of demand signal across a range of issues, economic as well as social.
Well, this brings me to an interesting point. You've mentioned legality now several times. To be sure, there are international agreements. Trade deals have components that are legally enforced. But what we have seen in practice in the past is that it can be very difficult for especially indigenous populations or smaller producing groups to actually seek and gain redress when they are faced with the possibility of long drawn out lawsuits in different jurisdictions against big multinational corporations. How do you square that? I mean, the principle of legality versus the practice.
Well, the EU has diplomatic representation in every single country that it's importing commodities from. I think it should be. We talked about the need for some sort of cultural and organisational changes in the trade negotiation bit of the EU. I think there also needs to be some cultural and organisational changes in the sort of diplomatic representation of the EU overseas. I've had the pleasure of working, on an EU Commission-funded project for 4 years in the Amazon. They were excellent to work with, but it was very clear that their diplomatic team was incredibly overworked. It was a small group of people, dedicated, hardworking, but the volume of work was just too great. I think the EU has to invest actively in its capacity overseas, in country, because there's no substitute for in country presence. It needs to be monitoring, the situation on the ground. It needs to be, talking to the indigenous organizations who are highly organized in every Latin American country. If stuff is going on, you'll find out about it, but only if you've got people in country who are involved in those conversations and have those relationships. I don't see that as particularly difficult to do.
Before we get to the final question, I wanted to ask you, you seem still quite optimistic about the future of sustainability in international trade. That's certainly not a sentiment shared by everybody. But what makes you optimistic about that future?
Well, a number of things. I mean, I don't think that I'm blindly optimistic. As I've said, I think the metric of deforestation levels it's not great. I think two things really make me optimistic. One is the level of civil society organization that you've seen grow in producing countries over the last 10, 15 years, and this isn't just in Brazil; it's across the board. You see it in Africa, you see it in Southeast Asia as well. And those organizations have more financial resources now. They're better organized. They've got much better technology. That's a really important, advance. We've got people walking around sensitive areas with sort of, handheld GPS things. We've got like Global Forest Watch. We've got all kinds of tools that we didn't have before that civil society organizations can use. So that's one reason for optimism. I think the other reason for optimism is you see everywhere how climate change and ESG and all of that is shooting up political agendas. You see how politicians across the world, whatever their political complexion, Bolsonaro in the last few weeks being a stunning example, will like it or not, hostile or friendly, they have to respond. And I think it's reasonable that what we're seeing now is just a foretaste of where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years' time. So that does make me feel optimistic. I don't see how even the worst actors here are going to be able to resist the sort of pressure that's building over these issues.
Well, I want to ask you our final question, which is the same one we ask of everybody, which is, if you were to give one policy or one idea to make this food system more sustainable, what would it be?
Well, my particular thing is deforestation. So I'm going to zero in on what's the single most important thing to get deforestation down. It's a habitat credit, some kind of credit for farmers to preserve the vegetation on their land and transition to zero deforestation production. And right now it doesn't exist. I think the existing kind of inducements to farmers through carbon markets, offsets of various kinds, biodiversity credits, none of them work at the scale necessary, and they're all really complicated. So we have to have something that basically throws all of that out the window, a completely new system. And I would actually just take this opportunity to plug a recent initiative called RIMBA, which I think is a really interesting example of how this might work. It's a coalition of a number of actually European companies, Unilever, Nestle, a couple of others. They've got together with UK Aid, with a couple of financial institutions, and they've set up this fund to attract impact capital to fund biodiversity projects, largely in Indonesia. And I think you could do that on such a larger scale, and you could get similar coalitions behind that kind of thing, and you could deploy it along supply chains instead of channeling it to individual projects. So that's the kind of thing. It's not exactly the thing, but it's the kind of thing that I think we're going to need to see over the next few years. And once we see it, and I have no doubt that we will, because this conversation is moving really fast, I think then finally we will see some really significant downturns in deforestation.
David Cleary, Director for Agriculture at the Nature Conservancy, and also speaker at our upcoming event on 26 May at the FFA regional event in Portugal on this very issue. Thank you very much for joining Food Systems today.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
You've been listening to an episode of Food Systems, a podcast brought to you by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. In the aftermath of the FFA 2021 month of March, we will be going to a weekly release schedule to bring you follow-up interviews with some of our great speakers. To make sure you get all updates, please subscribe on your podcast app as well as on Twitter @ForumForAg to get content on this podcast, news, as well as all other month of March related content. Please check out our website www.forumforagriculture.com. Thank you for listening and enjoy your day.